Yes, you're right, Colonel. He had told South about Ramu's warning many times since that fateful encounter, but suddenly was all too conscious of the fact that he hadn't heeded the alien's wise words. The Ramu later was not being used for the benefit of all mankind. It was being used to enrich a banking cartel. Where does all the money go to, Colonel, on the profits the banks make by creating credit? That really is a bit of a mystery, sir. But what I can say is that certainly since the inception of the Federal Reserve in 1913, the United States has been going progressively in hock to the banking system. This is why we have the absurd spectacle of virtually annual tax increases. Society itself has never been wealthier. The true wealth of society is the goods and services it can provide, which means primarily new technology and human hands and brains to use it, of course. Yet all the time we're told that rather than resources becoming more bountiful, they're becoming scarcer. Resources are not becoming scarcer, sir. But money is, Colonel. He struck the table and suddenly he saw through the fog, saw through it with crystal clarity. Precisely, sir. I think we should tell Rockman something needs to be done. With respect, sir, I think Rockman is the last person we should tell. Oh, why is that? It's part of the problem, sir. The vested interest of usual capitalism. He is? Of course, sir. Your predecessor took on the banks. Richard Powers, said the President with some surprise. He never considered the previous occupant of the Oval Office to be any sort of reformer, much less a financial reformer. No, sir, said South, lowering his voice. Mr. Lincoln. Mr. Lincoln? He was perplexed. Abraham Lincoln, he all but shouted. Yes, sir, and look what they did to him. Who? The bankers, sir. They killed him. They did? South nodded his head slowly. James Hunter didn't know what to say. He wondered for a moment what sort of bizarre conspiracy theories South had been reading, and was apt to dismiss his aide's words as flights of fantasy. But suddenly a thought occurred to him. You think Rockman would kill me? Of course not, sir, not in this day and age. The President heaved a sigh of relief, but South added, there are all sorts of other ways. Other ways, he asked? To skin a cat, sir. Don't forget that Rockman has enormous power, not just in banking and industry, but in the media. It doesn't take much to start a smear campaign. Smear campaign? He couldn't smear me with anything, Colonel. Could he? South was well aware of the President's squeaky clean image, and that this image mirrored his personal and private life exactly. It wasn't that James Hunter was any sort of saint, it was just that he'd never had the imagination for sin. He'd been born into a comfortably rich family, had lived a comfortable life, and never had any illicit love affairs simply because he was at heart quite a boring person, as was his First Lady. For someone who had characteristically been so boring, though, he was swiftly becoming extremely imaginative. Could he? Repeated the President. Look, sir, I know, we all know that you've never come within a mile of any scandal, but the public don't know that. Suppose someone turns up who claims to have known you 20 years ago and makes all manner of allegations about crooked dealings in real estate or liaisons with a senator's wife. You ought to know what you were doing 20 years ago. If you deny everything and the press picks up on some detail you got wrong and blows it up out of all proportion, anything can happen. You think Rockman will go to those extremes, Colonel? You know the way the media operates, sir. If they take a dislike to someone, they keep hurrying away, they won't let it go. But they don't dislike me, do they? He asked. Of course not, sir, but they haven't been told to, yet. Yes, I see, he said. Then how are we going to reform the financial system without appearing to, and without the media blaming us? That's a good question, sir. I think what we need is to find a front man. A front man? Yes, sir. If we can find an academic who is at least sympathetic to the idea of financial reform, bring him in, then if you can get him onto the committee. I see, Colonel. Who have you got in mind? No one yet, sir. But give me a couple of days and I'll find someone. Very good, Colonel. I'll see you at the weekend. James Hunter was rapidly becoming paranoid. He realised that in theory he was the most powerful man in the United States. But of course the power he wielded was, if not entirely symbolic, then not his to wield for his own purpose. The President was not his own man but a servant of the people. Rockman, on the other hand, was powerful in his own right. When he pulled strings, people jumped for him. The following week, South told the President he had located a professor of economics who was sympathetic to the subject of financial reform. James Hunter invited Professor Maloney to the White House and listened to what he had to say. After the Professor had spoken at length in a boring monotone about the perceived defects of the current system, the President chirped in, You don't share my aide's views about this being a conspiracy. The Professor frowned and said, Conspiracy? Yes, by Rockman and bankers generally. He laughed this time. When people are onto a good thing, Mr. President, they don't conspire, they work together enthusiastically towards the same ends. You can see the same vested interests at work in organised crime, the labour movement, or anywhere else where one group strives to maximise its profits at the expense of the general public. But Colonel South says banks have a monopoly of credit, as it were. Indeed, but if they didn't, they wouldn't be banks. Yes, that's true, said the President, but this creating credit out of nothing, that's all wrong. So is the war on drugs, Mr. President. So are a lot of things in our society. But we must strive to put these wrongs right, either by legislation or by a repeal of legislation. Which must be done in this case, he asked. In the long term, the repeal of the Federal Reserve Act. In the short term, we have to increase the purchasing power of the consumer, and we have to make sure that this purchasing power is distributed to everyone. Everyone, said the President. Everyone, said the Professor. Everyone, echoed South. For the benefit of all mankind, said James Hunter. Not for Rock Bank Limited, not for American business, not even for America, but for all mankind. It is, Mr. President, our common cultural inheritance, continued the Professor. When an inventor comes up with a new device, provided he is granted a patent, he will reap the rewards in fiscal terms, but the entire community benefits. The two best examples are the first two, fire and the wheel. If the man who discovered fire and the man who invented the wheel had been able to patent their inventions, we'd probably still be living under some sort of feudal system now. We're not suggesting we do away with patents, asked the President. People need incentives. If they don't benefit from their inventions themselves, they won't invent. Of course, Mr. President, but giving someone a financial reward or recognition for an invention is not the same as allowing him to exploit it for financial gain while the rest of mankind has to eat raw meat or walk everywhere. James Hunter could see the logic of this argument, but it sounded suspiciously like socialism to him. But South's next words rendered the Professor's argument superfluous. If you invent a new power source and decide to exploit it commercially, Mr. President, then that is your right. No one will deny you a reward. But we haven't invented anything. The rhymulator was given to us. We are simply its custodians. We have no right to exploit it commercially. You're right, he said, but you have to fund its production somehow. The funding for the manufacture of rhymulators must be created debt-free, said the Professor. And it must come into circulation in the country where the machines are made. A rhymulator represents a net increase in the wealth of the nation. The money supply of that nation must reflect this. So for the sake of example, Japan manufactures 100,000 machines, there must be an increase in the yen in circulation equal to the cost of 100,000. Of course, if the machines are exported, that wealth should come from overseas buyers. The Professor went on in this vein, and although his ideas became slightly more complex, for once James Hunter found himself not totally lost. He concluded rapidly that although the minutiae of running an economy must be extremely technical, it could be described in simple terms, and more to the point, understood in simple terms. Everyone understood, for example, that a patient undergoing a heart transplant operation had to have his own heart removed and the donor heart substituted. The operation might be extremely technical, and there would of course be drugs, exercise and therapy for long afterwards, but fundamentals could be grasped by any 10-year-old. When the Professor finished speaking, the President said he would arrange for him to be drafted onto the committee forthwith. When the two men left him, he couldn't help thinking that South knew a great deal more than he was letting on, and that although he, the President, had initiated this interview, he had been manipulated into it. He determined to find out as much as he could about Professor Maloney, but he seemed to be as obscure an academic as one could hope to meet. Certainly there was nothing in his professorial record which could be construed as radical or anti-establishment, and least of all was there anything to indicate that he was any kind of financial reformer.